Hi, I'm so glad to see you. Welcome to week 3. I'm at home. Are you at home? Are you at school? Are you thinking about, the light is too bright, the Birchbark house? I've been thinking a lot about our friend Omakayas and how they were gathering berries and drying food for the winter. Day was home. Mama, I think this happened after we stopped reading together, but Mama ended up throwing a big stick at the crow Ande because she thought that Ande ate the dried berries, but we know it was Pinch. I think Mama figured that out too. Pinch was a little bit naughty. Omakayas met up with her baby bear friends, and they remembered her. We're going to start reading again at the very end of fall in chapter 8, First Snow. The air in the cabin was brilliant. There was a flash to the light that told her it had snowed while she slept. The first snow. "Ay-ya!" Pinch screamed, throwing off his rabbit skin blanket to run outside. "Don't slide on the lake yet." Mama knew what he was up to and raced to the door after him to stop him from running straight out onto the ice. Although the cold was sudden and the snow had fallen thick and mysterious overnight, the water of the lake was still open just past a skim of delicate ice on shore. It would be dangerous to walk out on the ice. Already, the air was warming up a little, at least where the sun shone brightest. Mama was worried that Day would not. Oops, I turned too many pages. Mama was worried that Day would not manage to make the crossing before the freeze up. If he couldn't, he would have to wait in camp until the ice was solid, and he and his men could pull their toboggans of stretched furs across to sell to the traders. Down the cleared path now, striding large, feather nodding in time with each long step, came Old Tallow. She held her long rifle loosely under one arm and growled her anin at Omakayas as she tramped into the brush. Omakayas called back, and Old Tallow's hand went up in an abrupt wave, though she didn't turn to look or certainly to smile. Her dogs followed at her heels, great and wolfish. The slinking yellow dog paused to turn and bare its broken brown teeth at Omakayas, but she crossed her eyes at him and couldn't have cared less. First snow day always lifted her out of her skin, made her feel sharp and alive. The snow, not deep, softening, gleamed in a white cover over all that she could see. Each branch was neatly outlined, and some still bore their leaves. Omakayas and Angeline admired the intricate way that the snow trimmed the dried reeds of cattails, and the brown furry heads were capped in tiny white mounds that made them look. "Delicious, Minopogwad," Angeline pretended to bite. "Take this." Not only was Pinch annoying, but he had good aim. Just as Omakayas turned, she caught a firm-packed snowball in the side of her face. The snow stung. Pinch had packed a little stone in it. The wet snow licked her neck. Omakayas ran at him without a word and threw herself on him, buried him face first in a mound of snow directly beside the path. "Gago!" Pinch howled and leaped up, mad, packed more snowballs together, and set off after his laughing sisters. The more he ran on his short legs, though, the faster they galloped ahead. There was not a chance that he would catch them. He knew it and finally stopped. He slumped down near the side of the path, muttering to himself and putting more snowballs together until he had a big pile. At the heart of each, he packed a stone. Stones he hoped would sting his sisters until they cried. The girls walked farther into the town, knowing Mama was busy, hoping she wouldn't miss them quite yet. It was exciting to live around other people again, and both of the girls wanted to find out if old friends had stayed to winter. They wanted to see if any new families had come to live near. Angeline was thinking of going to the Catholic mission school, and she wanted to sneak by and see if anyone was there yet, studying the signs and marks that the priest made with a soft white stick on the big black wall. They walked to the edge of the schoolyard and then stood outside in the clear air, in the sun, breathing the fragrance of fresh, wet snow and new bread, crusty and warm. The sing-song, reciting voices floated from inside the log schoolhouse. Omakayas was glad they were outside, but Angeline's face was turned eagerly toward the sound of the priest's instructions. She was curious to know what was happening, but remembered Grandma's advice. Take their ways if you need them, she said, but don't forget your own. You are Anishinaabe. Your mother and your grandmother are Wolf Clan people. Don't forget. Also, you sweat bath yourself clean every day, even jump in the freezing lake, a thing that the Chimikamanu do not do. My girls, don't become like them. Just as the thought of Grandma made Omakayas smile, there was a flurry of stamping feet as children of all ages burst from the back door, leaping wide, flinging themselves forward in a laughing frenzy, thrilled with the prospect of new snow and ready to have their morning break, their fun, and then their small meal of smoked whitefish and bread. Aye, Neshki! Angeline pointed in amazement, stepping with easy care down the stairs of the schoolhouse, solemn, carrying his tobacco pouch, his knife at his belt, was none other than Fishtail. What was he doing at the school? He did not join the children in their wild play, but walked directly from the school toward his camp. Fishtail lived at the very edge of the village, hidden in deep brush. His place was built the old way. It was a birchbark house, but it was quite warm in winter because he knew how to heap the sides with snow, and he was an excellent trapper. The interior of his house was always lined with strung skins, hung with lush furs made up into sleeping robes and red and white point blankets. His wife, Angeline's best friend, Ten Snow, was known as a fine bead worker. People said that she tanned hides so soft that they felt to the skin like the slippery velvet that the traders sold. Let's find out what he's doing, whispered Angeline. He was visiting the school, said Omakayas. What's to find out? I don't think so. Angeline pointed to the book, the sheaf of shamukum on paper, evidence in Fishtail's hand that he had another motive for attending school. Okay, said Omakayas, now curious. You go ask him. Aye, Angeline blushed. Scared? No, I'm not. You are so. Challenged, Angeline jumped forward. She walked so swiftly after Fishtail that Omakayas ran to keep up. But when she got to him, she walked beside him with no word. Didn't she know what to say? Omakayas trotted behind, just within earshot. What were you doing back there? Angeline finally had the courage to ask. I went to the priest's school. to learn to read the Shumukamon's tracks. That way they can't cheat us with their treaties. Surprised and taken aback at this, Angeline and Omakayas could only stand still and watch him as he walked swiftly, gracefully back to his home. They turned to go, still thoughtful. The sun was warm as summer, and by the time they returned, all the snow had melted in the heat. They took the same path back they had taken before, and as they neared the cabin, all of a sudden, Omakayas felt a wet slap and a sharp, stinging blow on the back of her head. It was Pinch. Dancing with gleeful anger, foot to foot, his snowballs so watery only the pebbles are their centers were left in a pile around his feet. He nevertheless insisted on his revenge. I said I'd get you, and I got you, he yelled. I'm the warrior, Big Pinch. Not long after that first bright snow, another snow fell, grayer and heavier. The ice came in. The water had a transparent skim that broke apart and clicked together, then went solid again until there formed a tough gray coat of ice. Day surely had stopped to camp and to wait until the ice was thick before moving on. It snowed steadily and long 3 days. While the snow fell outside, Angeline's friend, Ten Snow, used the red cloth Day had brought last summer as trim for a blue trade cloth dress she and Angeline were making. It was ribbon trimmed, graceful dress. Mama had trimmed a matching shawl with thimbles so that when she and Angeline jingled softly and enticingly when she walked. Every so often now, she was allowed to visit Auntie Muskrat's house. That was the only place she was allowed to visit alone, for Auntie Muskrat kept a strict eye on her. Any young men who visited would have to stand or sit outside on Auntie's log bench while Angeline stayed, dancing foot to foot inside the cabin, craning out the window and laughing. The snow fell deeper yet, and in its grip, old Tallow had the best of luck. On the last day it snowed, she dragged from the farthest end of the island 2 plump beavers. The furs were thick, and she would catch. I lost my spot. The furs were thick and would fetch a good trade. She roped the beavers onto a little sled tied to another rope that circled her waist. Happily, she brought the meat to Mamma and Grandma to prepare. She stayed in the yard, smoking her little pipe, while they made a fire outside to roast the meat over the coals. Although snow had fallen, Omakayas thought it couldn't be truly winter until old Tallow put on her remarkable coat. Every year, the children watched to see that coat emerge, big and shaggy and always different, sewed with new furs, patched with discarded calicos, even velvet. Old Tallow would wear it until the earliest days of spring. But now, even though the cold already bit in the mornings, she wore only her one earth-colored dress with the raveled hem. She even looked a little too warm as she bent near the fire, pulling a burning stick out to relight the new wad of tobacco in her pipe. She leaned back, adjusting her hat, and stared long at Omakayas. Omakayas looked into the fire. It was her job to keep smoothing and arranging the coals into an even bed for baking the meat. But Tallow's eyes on her back made her itch. Whenever old Tallow looked at her like that, she could feel those fierce eyes resting on her skin. There was something peculiar in old Tallow's look, something different from the way she looked at every other human. It was something familiar, though, and this time, as Omakayas glanced back and caught a corner, just a little shred of that look, she suddenly understood. Old Tallow was looking at her the same way she looked at her dogs. This was not a bad thing. In fact, it was good in a way, for in Old Tallow's look there was true affection, something she didn't feel for other humans. It made Omakayas feel both strange and safe. She smiled to herself and had the odd, sudden, curious knowledge that if ever it came to that, Old Tallow would protect her, Omakayas, with her own life. She didn't know why she knew that, but she just knew. Soon, Nokomis came out and took over, poking the coals this way and that to evenly set them. Soon she would burn a fine crust onto the skin. Beaver or a meek was Day-Day's favorite meat. He loved the burnt flavor of its fat, and Mama cooked it in a special way. As soon as the meat singed and slightly burnt, she cleaned the beavers, washed their carcasses with salted water, and stuffed them with corn and potatoes. She then sewed them shut and roasted them slowly in the big iron kettle. They sizzled in their own fat, and the acorns burned black. When the beavers were tender and completely cooked through, she removed them, undid the meat from the bones, mixed the stuffing with fried acorns, and cooked it all together in a soup once again. The aroma had Old Tallow pacing back and forth hungrily. She looked eager as the dogs, and when Mamma ladled the soup into her bowl, she bent to it with a savage will. Eating swiftly, Old Tallow put away one bowl and then another, while Mamma was dishing up the rest of the meal. It was lucky she ate so quickly, though, and put away so much, for just as Pinch was wiping bread across the bottom of his bowl and opening his mouth to ask for more, there was a stamping and shouting outside. The dogs barked, then stopped when a familiar voice shouted, "Gago! Gago!" It was Day-Day. Come home. As if summoned across the new ice by his favorite dish, he arrived in time to eat until he could eat no more. That night, the children went upstairs and slept in the loft, and Nokomis slept there too, instead of downstairs beside Mamma. Nokomis made her bed at the farthest end of the loft where it was coolest. She put her old rabbit skin blanket down and slept on top of it. "I sleep hot," she explained to the children. They didn't like to tell her, but she also slept noisy. Nokomi snored and often talked in her sleep, calling out to people from long ago. That night, Omakayas woke in the dark and listened to her grandmother's soft, regular breathing, and then her murmur, half understandable, sometimes arguing and sometimes pleasant as she dreamed old times and went visiting to places that only she remembered. Biboon, winter. Their cabin is covered in snow. Chapter 9, Blue Ferns. Snow filled the world, falling deeper and deeper, changing the island. The cabin was made in the Shinmukamon way. Day-Day was proud of its snug construction, with thick logs fitted together as closely as possible. The heaviest mud he could find, the stickiest clay. Day-Day tamped between the logs to seal the cracks. He'd put cross beams up top and split logs to make a tiny loft where Omakayas, Angeline, and Pinch slept on their woven reed mats placed over tufts of moss. Grandma still slept at the coldest end of the loft, only now in her thick rabbit fur blanket. Cold crept along the floor. Omakayas was glad of the boring time she'd spent in the summer pressing fistfuls of gumbo clay taken from the center of the island into those places where the dried mud had crumbled. In between the chink, that's called chinking, between the logs of her cabin. The warmest places in the house were on the sides she had mended best. Cold air sneaked in just where she'd run out of muck and had to use grass. Sometimes the wind whistled when it entered. That thin whine sent a shiver down her back. Now that Day Day was home, the cabin changed. Filled with his traps and blankets, his big man's coat and head wrap, his moose hide mitts and traveling kettles, ice chisels, axe, his moccasins, old again within Mamma's embrace, and his new gun secure on pegs over the door. The cabin seemed smaller, cozier, in a way more interesting, Omakayas thought, and more difficult, too. People stopped in at any time of day or even in the deep of night, and these visitors required constant attention. Yellow Kettle and Grandma were known as the keepers of a good store of food and a warm fire, although Omakayas, Angeline, and Pinch were the ones responsible for hauling the water for tea and chopping the wood for the fire that burned in the proud little hearth. The fires needed constant vigilance, as did family needs. Day Day's gun required his concentrated care, and he liked tea at his elbow while he cleaned the workings in the barrel. It seemed to Omakayas that every time the grown-ups began to talk, they discussed travel routes west. They argued whether the pressure of so many newcomers was going to send them the way so many others were sent into the territory of the Buanuk, the Dakota. There was now constant talk of government intentions, plans to meet in council, invitations to smoke the pipe. At least there were less serious visitors, including Two Strike Girl, Wishcob, and Auntie Muskrat, Twilight, and Little Bee. Angeline's favorite friend, young Ten Snow, came by to visit almost every day. Albert Lapotra came early to tell his dreams to Day Day, who tried to take them seriously. Last night, I dreamed my head got stuck in a kettle, he revealed, his voice low and troubled. It must have been a very big kettle, Day Day said solemnly, for Lapotra had a big round head and a full moon face. Gay gay, said Lapotra. He never understood teasing jokes. It was big. Even so, what does it mean? Some dreams are so powerful they are beyond our humble ability to comprehend, said Day Day. Lapotra leaned back, satisfied. Only Mama caught Day Day's wink. Even old Tallow stopped to eat whenever she was given, often standing outside the door and bolting soup before she hurried off to hunt. That's a picture of old Tallow in her coat. And yes, she had now donned her coat. The coat of old Tallow was a fantastic thing, woven of various pelts, including one of lynx, one of beaver, a deer hide, and two that belonged to beloved dogs. She had pieced together old blankets, one a faded red, one brown. Discarded shreds of unidentifiable stuffs were sewed patch on patch, including some black beaded velvets and bright calicos. The coat fit across her in a great mound and flapped when she moved. She wore it well, springing lightly along like a huge tattered bear. No cold seemed to bother old Tallow, but if it was too biting a day to walk outside or slide on the ice, Ten Snow and Angeline sat in the corner of the cabin on bedrolls and piles of skins. There, light from the window of thick oiled paper fell golden on their faces, and the two young women sewed and talked. Ten Snow had finished something very impressive, much admired by the other women, including Grandma, who took it in her hands and blessed it one cold day. It was a bag for Fishtail, a fashionable bandolier bag. Instead of the dyed quills Grandma used so skillfully, Ten Snow had sewn the bag with trade beads bought in precious packets at the company store. The bag was covered with 4 beaver skins worth of white beads. They were expensive. Fishtail's square bag was beaded all over in swirls of green vines, leaves, and glowing crimson flowers that popped out vividly against the white beads of the background. The shoulder strap, too, was entirely beaded. The strap's design was simple, unusual, and consisted of blue curls that Ten Snow bashfully explained were the uncoiled heads of new spring ferns, her husband's favorite food. Looking at it, Omakayas had to blink her eyes, for the beads were so perfect and the repeated patterns so compelling that the ferns seemed to move like little waves. Will you teach me how to bead that pattern? Angeline asked her friend. Ah, yeah. Ten Snow removed from her little sewing kit a needle, and Angeline took out her own work, her own beads, bought with dried whitefish. They began. Gay, I mean, said Omakayas. Me too. Ten Snow smiled gently, and Angeline looked at her little sister in surprise. You, she grinned, little frog, little jumper, can you sit still that long? Stung by her sister's amused tone of voice, Omakayas dropped her head to her chest, eyes squinting narrow. A huge space opened up in her head, black and rushing as a freezing water stream. She was old enough to tan the stinking old hides, wasn't she? Her work was valued there, wasn't it? Why shouldn't she be trusted to use the precious beads? She was 8 winters now. She wasn't that little. She could chop wood, haul the water from the hole Nokomis kept open in the ice with an axe and a long, sharp pole. Why couldn't she bead like the older girls? Angeline laughed out loud. Omakayas turned away. Her heart shrunk cold in her chest, tiny but heavy as a lake rock. How her sister's words could stab her sometimes. But now, as though she hadn't noticed Angeline's remark at all, Ten Snow's hand was stroking Omakayas' arm and she was speaking. Shh, little sister, I made something for you. Into Omakayas' hand, she placed a small leather packet. Omakayas looked up at Ten Snow, uncertain. Yes, for you. Ten Snow gestured for her to open it, and slowly, with unbelieving delight, Omakayas did. The leather packet was lined with broadcloth, and into the cloth 2 needles were stuck. 2. Around a peeled twig, Ten Snow had wound a long length of the finest sinew thread to use in beading. At the end of the cloth, a small pocket held a lump of fragrant, summery yellow beeswax to use in strengthening the sinew thread. And best of all, as she saw, as Ten Snow lifted up the dark blue strip of cloth, there was a tiny sack of all colors of beads, seed beads, the little grown-up kind of beads, shining and gleaming against the cloth. That is amazing. Next week, we're going to do some beading too. We have bead kits for you all. A little while later, we're going to skip because I want to read you. We're going a little long today, but I want to read you Grandma's story. This is a story that Omakayas' grandmother is going to tell them about when she was a young girl, 8 years old, just as old as Omakayas is now. Fishing the dark side of the lake. When I was just a little girl, said Nokomis, her voice lilting high, dropping low, her voice far away, I was told by my grandfather, who I lived with, who raised me, never to fish the dark side of the lake. Why, you wonder? I never knew that either. Never found out until, of course, being a young girl and very curious, I took my grandfather's canoe out one day while he was sleeping. I put my fishing spear and nets in the canoe. I would fish where the water was deepest, strongest, bluest on clear days, and blackest on the cloudy days. That's where I paddled. I had a stick and line. I let that down, baited, and I waited to see what sort of fish I would catch. The wait was long, my grandchildren, and as I fished there, I grew uneasy. I remembered my grandfather's warnings, the way he insisted that I was never to approach this deep water. I'd seen him looking out there, sometimes at sunset, his eyes sad and clear. Sometimes he, oh my goodness, they want to stop us. They don't think we're still here. But Grandma is still telling her story. She has wild plums in the bottom of the boat as a snack. Fresh wild plums. I had taken dark red plums with me as I sat in the boat waiting for the fish to bite. I put them slowly, one by one, into my mouth. What was wrong with this side of the lake? I had to wonder. Except for the depth and darkness, it wasn't much different. I would find out what was different, I decided. I kept my line in the water. My bait must have been wrong, though. My bait must have been no good. I didn't get a bite, even a little nibble. Maybe, I thought, Grandfather told me not to fish this dark side of the lake because no fish lived here. That would be a joke on me. Just then, I looked over the side of the boat and I spilled all the rest of my plums into the water. I was disgusted. Down they went to the bottom. Not long after they sank from sight, though, I had a strong tug on my line. Then, not just a tug, a real pull. Soon I was struggling to keep from being dragged overboard. I had caught something, something very huge. A hand reached out of the water, pulled itself up my fishing line, finger over finger, fist over fist, until suddenly the beautiful face of a woman appeared. She looked up at me and kept climbing. "Do you have more plums?" she asked. I said no, but I helped her into the boat anyway. Her hair was black and endlessly long, covering her, and underneath it she was naked. Her smile was gentle. Her skin was purple, gray, cold, the color of those plums. There was something familiar about her, something awful and yet familiar. I was very much afraid and began to paddle quickly back to Grandfather. Still, I was a curious child. "Who are you?" I asked as we traveled along. "I am your grandmother," she said. "Here's what happened. Long ago, I married your grandfather. We could not be parted. We were like one person, he and I. He was stingy with me. After I bore our first child and lay her in his arms, after she grew for a year, I became my daring self again. I became again the wild girl he'd loved from the beginning. One night, I dared him to swim with me in the lake. We went out in our canoe to the deepest part of the lake, the darkest and the coldest side, where you have found me. We threw off our clothing. I dived in down until I reached the bottom. My dear grandchild, that's when I got lost. It was so dark down at the bottom that I got turned around. I could not find my way back up again, and I was so tired. I curled up in the cold weeds and I went to sleep until now. My grandmother looked toward the shore. Her face glowed in the sunlight. I saw as we approached that she was watching my grandfather as he came down the path from the camp to the edge of the lake. He walked closer, closer. Something strange happened. I rubbed my eyes. I passed my hand across my face. I could not believe what I was seeing. As he approached, my grandfather's step seemed to pick up life. His hair got darker and darker until it turned the pure black of his youth. Lines disappeared from his face. He straightened his bowed back. Just as the canoe touched the shore, he smiled. And oh, my grandchildren, suddenly he had all of his teeth. I got out of the canoe. He looked upon me kindly, said goodbye to me, and then he took my place in the canoe with his young wife. The two gazed into each other's faces with great happiness. I watched them paddle away together into the darkness, into the night. Shooting stars passed over through the sky. The lake was silent. I never again saw my grandfather, but eventually his clothing was found on the shore, washed up on the dark side of the lake. That's a beautiful story that Omakayas' grandmother told to her grandchildren about when she was a little girl. Do you have a grandparent who tells you stories? I did. I had a wonderful storytelling grandmother. And I hope you know somebody who likes to tell you stories about when they were little. If your family is reading along, the rest of winter is a little bit scary in Omakayas' family. Sickness comes to their cabin, and they have to work really hard to survive the winter. I hope you come to visit us at the library this week. Come and get a really fun craft kit, and join us again next week to hear about spring. It will finally be spring in Omakayas' world. Have a happy week.